Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, which is titled The Technology Access Gap and Creative Solutions. I'm Judith Sebesta, and I'm your moderator for today. I serve as the Executive Director of the Digital Higher Education Consortium of Texas, also known as Digitex. And I'll start by introducing our two distinguished speakers for today, and then I'll turn it over to both of them. And at the end, we will be sure and have plenty of time for question and answer. So if you have questions, please be free to drop them into chat, and I'll be monitoring that as Nate and Mordecai speak. Very pleased to introduce Mordecai Ian Brownlee, who currently serves as the Vice President for Student Success at St. Philip's College, the only college in the nation federally designated as both a historically Black college and a Hispanic serving institution, which is located in San Antonio, Texas, just east of downtown, I believe. During his tenure as Vice President, Brownlee has led St. Philip's to record enrollment of over 13,500 students and the college's three largest degree and certificate conferments in its 122-year history. Well done, Mordecai. Brownlee also serves as an adjunct professor at Morgan State University and the University of Charleston, and is a higher education columnist for EdSurge. And Megan, are you able to show those oh, here we go. I think I can show. Yeah, there we go. There's an introductory slide for Mordecai. And I believe the next one shows St. Philip's College. Excellent. And if you'll move forward to our next slide. I'm also very pleased to introduce Nate Southerland, who leads Coconino Community College's efforts to create and deliver outstanding undergraduate and CTE programs and provide support for students to access and succeed in post-secondary education. In addition to supervising the faculty and academic leadership of CCC, he also oversees student development and support and takes an active role in community partnerships, including dual credit programs. Prior to joining Coconino Community College, sorry if I mispronounced that before, Nate, Southerland held a variety of roles at Salt Lake Community College and served as the adult education specialist for the Utah Education Network. Nate and Mordecai, thank you so much for joining us as speakers on this session. And Nate, Mordecai, I'll turn it over to you first.
All right, thank you so much, Judith, and just honored again. Thank you to WCET for this opportunity. And let's get started, colleagues. So as we talk about, really closing the digital divide, as we talk about creating opportunities for our students, there's a few things that we certainly want to keep in mind, and we'll do so quickly. And so what I've done here is that this presentation here, you'll see on this link, it's one of my more recent articles from EdSurge. Here's how colleges should help close the digital divide in the COVID era. You know, one of the things that we can certainly understand is that in the midst of COVID, it has exacerbated some of the challenges that were being experienced within our college communities. Here in San Antonio, Texas, just to talk a little bit about St. Philip's College, we're one of 5 colleges that make up the Alamo colleges here in San Antonio, Texas. Essentially accounts for about 65,000 credit-bearing students with roughly 5,000 staff and faculty spread throughout the greater San Antonio area, which, by the way, San Antonio is the 7th largest city in the nation. A lot of folks may not be aware of that. Another piece that folks may not be aware of is that San Antonio, Texas itself has the highest poverty rate per capita in a metropolitan city in the nation. And so roughly about 3 years ago, we surpassed Detroit on that metric. So as we talk about the digital divide, as we talk about the technology gap present within our country, certainly from a metropolitan standpoint, San Antonio is at the forefront of that conversation. So it's with that lens that this article essentially was written as to what are the things that we're doing here in the Alamo colleges at St. Philip's College to close that gap for our students. And so, part of the things that we've been doing, part of what we've been doing is really approaching things with an equity-minded lens and really asking the question, what is it that we can do to ensure that we were clearing the pathways for our students in the midst of high levels of poverty, now in the midst of high levels of unemployment, because those that that are familiar with San Antonio, you know that we are strong in the culinary and hospitality and the hotel business and entertainment business. And so COVID-19 has hit those industries pretty pretty hard. So we've been dealing with a high level of unemployment. So as we talk about that technology gap, our students, once we pivoted towards online instruction, remote instruction, I should say, not all of our students were prepared for that opportunity. And you'll hear Dr. Southerland talk about a little bit about that as well in his community. So digital divide is a term used to describe the gap between society, between those who have access to the internet and those who do not. And so as we talk about poverty, certainly that is driving a driving force behind that. COVID-19 has exacerbated a bit of what was happening. These issues were already present in a lot of cases within our institutions on a national scale, certainly here in San Antonio. But again, as we've dealt with the challenges here in our market, now more than ever, we're hearing these stories of crisis and concern. It is imperative that our institutions develop intentional strategies. And this is when we talk about that equity mindedness. This is when we talk about making sure that we are doing our part to clear the pathway for student success at our institutions. And so students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, certainly students of color, there's some recent research out there, Pell Institute research that really has been focusing in on, from a racial standpoint, the disconnect between African Americans and Hispanics, Latinx populations and their accessibility to internet access and broadband access in comparison to their white counterparts. And so as we talk about closing that digital divide, certainly institutions needing to have an understanding of the students in which they're serving, the challenges in which those students are serving, the students that they're serving, and what can they do strategically to create opportunities that are going to close those gaps. Students with disabilities, active military, veterans, these are student populations. Certainly at your institutions, I'm sure that you have an equity metrics that you're following. If not, I highly want to encourage you to have those conversations at your institutions, because as we talk about knowing your students, it's that information in addition to the various means in which you can collect information to understand the voice of your students, who you're serving, their challenges. It's so much more than just looking at who's Pell eligible at your respective institutions. That only tells part of the story. Now it's the time for institutions to innovate their approaches to access, engagement, and responsiveness. That responsiveness is key. Next slide, please. In terms of our ability to meet the charges of our students, that one slide there, I think we went two by accident there. There we go. So tips on how to close the digital divide. This is why you're here, and we're looking forward to the question and answer. So I'm going to speed through this here and open opportunity for Dr. Southerland to share his thoughts. And so know your students. Dive into the data. What information can you collect on the front end at your institution, your application process, your onboarding process, to get a sense of where that student is coming from, their zip code, their earnings, not just FAFSA. FAFSA collects part of that picture. Based on where you are in the nation, your incoming application may create some of that database for you to understand who your students are. But for those of you all, especially that have control over your application process, now is the time more than ever to be very strategic with the questions in which you're asking students and the information that you're gathering, especially as we talk about the advocacy lens of supporting your students at multiple points in time throughout their academic pathway and protecting them from moments of crisis, as well as ensuring that they have an equitable footing to complete their academic pathways. Know the voice of your students. Now more than ever is a time where if you have not been creating creative opportunities to hear the voice of your students, please do so. You know, before COVID, I would tell you we had certain instruments like the SESI and Ruffalo Noah Levitt that we were utilizing to hear the voice of our students. But now is a time where we're holding more, especially Zoom sessions with our students, opportunities for town halls to hear their concerns, because just as we have put plans in place for the fall 2020 semester and beyond, things are changing at a rapid pace. Our environment is changing, those challenges, the implications associated with it, and we have learned so much from our students, just listening to the challenges, listening to their perspective, their perceptions, and really just formatting and honing in on that student experience. Know the challenges of your students. We've talked about this. It's so much more than just the students that come forth expressing their challenges. There's so many students that don't come forth, right? So what can we do as we talk about that equity mindedness? What can we do systematically at our institutions to create more opportunities for equity and be ready to truly serve the students that are coming to our institutions? I would say, honestly, there's been too many institutions, and I think on a national scale, that essentially have their approach to student success, and they are rooted in that approach. However, now more than ever, rather than being rooted in the institution's approach to certain students, what can the institution do to change that ideology to truly serve the students in which are coming through the doors? And then make no assumptions. Make no assumptions. Institutions should be prepared to offer an array of student services, supports. One of the things that we were doing at St. Philip's College, Alamo Colleges, is not only providing the laptop program. We utilize Chromebooks. We also utilize a series of other laptops based on the academic instruction, the program of the student. As you can imagine, if you're in health sciences, maybe dealing in cybersecurity, you're going to need a different a profile of laptop in comparison to someone who's focusing on a general education course. So we made those available, but understanding the poverty scale and the issues, we also understood connectivity was the other part of that. So not only did they need the instrument, but they needed the means, the Wi-Fi hotspot access to be able to provide that to students. And that is being provided to them free of charge on loaner system. Once they finish their program and their courses, they're making their way back. Those instruments are making their way back to the institution to be able to be of service to someone else. And I would highly encourage institutions to not find creative ways to essentially add dollars on the backs of students in order to provide these services. And so just things to keep in mind on closing that gap. Clear the pathway for students and credential attainment. Certainly they want to complete. We want to do our part to help them complete. And one of the things I have for you here is a book that I've just recently finished reading, From Equity Talk to Equity Walk, Expanding Practitioner Knowledge for Racial Justice in Higher Education. As we talk about closing that digital divide, as we talk about creating opportunities for our students and really changing the ideologies, the methodology, our approach to student success and the students that we're serving in the midst of these very, very harsh times. These instruments, books like this can really help us in terms of making that change. So at this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Nate Southerland.
Nate, I think you're on mute. I believe that Megan has to do a setting where you can go off of mute. Megan, if you don't mind.
Okay, I am now unmuted. That was interesting. It said the host won't allow me to unmute. Thanks, Dr. Brownlee. I'm going to build a little bit on what Dr. Brownlee was talking about earlier. Megan, if you can go back a slide or two, that would be great. There we go. Perfect. Dr. Brownlee talked about making no assumptions, getting to know your students and their challenges. And I want to talk just a little bit about what our experience at Coconino Community College has been. First of all, I think context is a little bit important. Coconino County is the second largest county in the country by land area, 18,000 square miles. Our county is larger than 9 of the 50 states. So just to kind of give you a sense of, it is a huge geographical area with fairly low population density. The Grand Canyon forms the northern border of our county, and a third of our county is tribal land. As Dr. Brownlee mentioned, tourism in our area is certainly the #1 industry, and that has had huge impacts in the time of COVID. So just a little bit about our students. 60% first generation, most in need of remedial math and English. Many have never learned online before. We're experiencing significant levels of housing and food insecurity, even more so now because of the impact on hospitality and tourism and the number of people who are out of work. Many people in our county live in areas with little or no infrastructure, no paved roads, no running water, no electricity, no cell service. The picture off to the right on your screen, this is Supai Village. It's a small community in our county that's down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. To my knowledge, this is the only post office in the country that still receives mail delivery by mule. There are no roads into Supai Village. You either fly in by helicopter or you hike in a 9-mile trail. Those are the kinds of communities that we're trying to serve here in our county. And even those who have access to infrastructure are often competing with others in their household or in their communities to access limited bandwidth. For instance, Grand Canyon Village, which is run by the National Park Service, that's where a lot of the park employees live. There's a K through 12 school there, and those students have to get online at 2 a.m. in order to have enough bandwidth to do their homework, because during the day, all of the tourists take up the bandwidth on their social media posts. So just a few of the challenges. Megan, next slide, please, if you would. So we have done a lot to try and collect the student voice. Here's a few of the comments. I'm not going to read them, but I invite you to take a second and read those. One of the recent comments we had from a student was that they had to drive 25 miles to a hilltop to get enough cell signal in order to upload their week's homework and to download the assignments for their instructor. In our type of an area, that's fairly typical. Outside of the town of Flagstaff and a couple of other small communities, our population is so dispersed that it's not economically viable for those who build infrastructure like phone lines and cell towers to actually build out into those extremely remote rural areas, because they'll never recover their investment in terms of user fees. So lots of folks you could provide them devices till the cows come home, and yet they won't be able to do anything with those devices because the infrastructure is not there for them to even be able to connect with. On the other hand, interestingly, our escalation in the use of remote learning has actually helped some of our students because they no longer have to drive long distances to get to one of our campuses to go to school. So one of the things I would suggest is look for both the positives that you need to build on and the negatives that you need to ameliorate in the process of analyzing your approach. Next slide, please. Okay, so the implications. On the right, you'll see a photo of a living space that's not altogether untypical in our county. This is a traditional Navajo hogan. You'll notice that there's no power lines running to it. They don't have solar panels yet. They certainly don't have electricity running to it. And very likely the nearest cell tower is 50 to 100 miles away. So when you're designing and delivering, keep your audience in mind. Low tech or low bandwidth might actually work best. And not only do you have to think about how you're delivering the instruction, but understanding what the students know about how to engage in remote instruction is really important to teaching them how to be proficient learners. Many of the folks we're serving know how to use technology for recreation or for social engagement. They don't necessarily know how to use it as a learning tool. We need to make sure that we're focusing on teaching people how to learn remotely, not just providing it. One size doesn't fit all. There's parts of our county where our approach to remote learning has to be very different than in other parts of our county. And interesting, like I mentioned, some of what we're doing actually works better than what we did before. I'm going to take a moment and there was a really interesting article from Inside Higher Ed this morning highlighting tribal colleges and some of the things that they're doing to try and reach out creatively. So I'm going to post that link in the chat and then highlight just a couple of things that they've done. Recognizing that many of the people in our area cannot access infrastructure at home, Dene College, which is highlighted in this article, has been trying to create satellite or outreach sites throughout the county, small college locations in a strip mall or somewhere else where people can drive in and get access to that infrastructure that they can use to do their learning. Coconino Community College is in the process of doing something similar, where we're going around to various social gathering places, and we will be providing a local facilitator to help people through their remote instruction. So for those who don't know how to learn well, number one, we're bringing them to an area that has the infrastructure that they can access, local public schools, local commercial centers, local government agencies. We're bringing them to those locations and providing a facilitator to help them through their remote coursework, not only teaching them the skills and strategies, but also helping them to manage their time and stay on track. So you have to think differently about how you're delivering the learning. You also have to think differently about how to help people access it. All right, Megan, next slide. So know your students was the first. The second, know your faculty. And I would say parenthetically your other student service providers and other folks at the college as well. By instinct, faculty teach how they were taught. And there's a steep learning curve going on right now that I think a lot of us are experiencing that it simply cannot be ignored. We have spent a lot of time and effort over the last 6 months helping our faculty learn how to teach effectively using some of these remote tools. And many of them are doing things that previously they claimed could not be done online. How can you do a yoga class online? People have to be there doing yoga. How can you teach a biology lab online? People have to be getting their hands dirty and doing things. We're able to, through good professional development and through helping and funding course redevelopment, helping folks to learn how to teach in new ways. And unfortunately, like most of us, faculty often extrapolate from their own experience. Well, in my community, I have access to these things, and if it works for me, it must work for my students too. We have to use what we've learned from the students to challenge our ideas on our part of faculty and practitioners about what we think works. We also have to acknowledge that our faculty and our student affairs professionals live in the same communities with the same limitations as our students. They also have limited infrastructure. They're also competing for limited bandwidth with other household members. So those who are teaching and those who are learning are struggling with some of the same challenges. So implications, unrelenting focus on teaching and learning, asking what do I want my students to learn and what is the best way for them to learn that. The answer may or may not be the latest and greatest technology. Focus relentlessly on the learning and then use the tools and strategies that achieve that outcome. Megan, next slide. Know your partners. We are not, as educators, the only ones who are struggling with these challenges. We have social service agencies, we have public schools, we have others who are trying to serve the same residents with the same challenges. So the implication, share our resources and work together. One of the things that's been really interesting in this period of time is we've been in the process of partnering with economic development agencies to make the case for infrastructure build out because it serves both business and industry and education. Together we're able to make progress that we weren't able to make otherwise. It's interesting that Dr. Brownlee in his discussion of San Antonio and the challenges they have in a metropolitan area, the challenges I'm highlighting in a highly rural area, there are many of the same challenges. Working together, we can make progress on those challenges to help us move forward. I will mention one thing, and this is not a commercial plug of any kind, but it's something that we're watching with great interest in our very rural area. There's a project called Starlink right now. Elon Musk and his crew are in the process of putting satellites into the near Earth orbit to provide internet access to people in areas where it simply is not practical to build out this infrastructure. Let me give you an example of the impracticality of infrastructure build out. The Navajo Nation recently, as part of their CARES Act money, decided to allocate some money, a significant amount of money, to building electricity infrastructure, and they are using several $1 million to connect an additional 200 homes. That's the kind of cost that we're dealing with when we're talking about building out rural infrastructure. So some of our private industry partners can be an important asset for us when we're thinking about how to provide access to everyone equitably, no matter their location and access to these questions. So going back to what Dr. Brownlee said, know your students, don't make assumptions, know your faculty, and I'm going to add in know your partners as well. So thank you for your attendance today. I'm going to turn it back over to Judith to facilitate the Q&A.
Great, and Mordecai, thank you so much for that fascinating information about creative solutions at both Coconino Community College and St. Philip's College. You know, one thing that I'm struck by, and then I'll get to, we already have one question that I can ask you from participants, but one thing that really I'm struck by is the connection to something that Deborah Santiago said in the opening session. Institutions who know who they serve, know how to serve them well. And obviously, the primary constituent that our colleges serve, our students, and universities serve, are the students. But it's also, you know, make particularly a reminder that our institutions also serve faculty, staff, the communities in which they exist. It's a wider swath than I think many might pay attention to as they need to. But let me get to one question that we had come in on Feed Loop. This is from the great Molly McGill, and she wanted to know from both of you, do you have examples of how you, as institutional leaders, receive student data and student needs directly from the faculty? Your faculty know their students, she says. Is there a feedback process for you?
Go ahead, Mordecai. Oh, Megan, we better not ever mute ourselves ever again. I'll go while he's getting his microphone unmuted. Yes, some of what I mentioned, the quotes I gave were in a survey instrument that we sent directly to students. But as Molly mentioned, your faculty and your student affairs professionals very often are close to the students and are hearing their questions or concerns. We are having far more kinds of town hall or group discussions now than we ever were before, specifically with the intent to glean from our faculty and from our student affairs professionals, what are you hearing from students? What are they experiencing? What's working for them and what's not working for them? That doesn't happen unless you intentionally facilitate it. Sending out, things as simple as email periodically, tell me what you're hearing. Our faculty senate has been very involved in sort of curating some of the things they're hearing from faculty and passing them on to academic leadership. Our student affairs professionals, we have joint academic and student affairs meetings on a regular basis where we're asking folks to share with one another what they're hearing. Again, it doesn't happen by accident. And I will say in response to the comment in the opening session, we tend to know best those we serve. I'm not sure we always know well those who we are not currently serving. That's the challenge. There are people who we are not reaching because of how we do our business, and it's incumbent on us to learn their perspective as much as it's incumbent on us to learn the perspective of those we are serving.
Yeah, great points there, Dr. Southerland. And now that I'm out of mute jail, I would say that one of the things that we've done at St. Philip's College, Alamo Colleges, is that we've put in place what we call strategies for behavioral intervention. It's similar somewhat to what institutions would utilize as an early alert program. Back when I was with Houston Baptist University, we had an early alert program that we utilized. Whatever the instrument is, I would highly encourage that it be something that allows faculty and staff throughout the college to be able to provide the concerns being expressed, either being seen by the student, being expressed by the student, and that information is readily then made available to a team that is dedicated to not only receiving those responses, but already having strategies put in place to be able to respond to those crises, to respond to those concerns. And so that's essentially what we have put in place. And I will tell you that has significantly been able to address some of the severe issues that we've had happening in the midst of COVID, throughout the midst of COVID, the beginning of COVID, as we continue to work our way through this crisis. That's how we have heard the concerns of our students. So certainly thank you for that question. And it just needs to be some instrument that you all have to where you can hear the concerns of your students and have a team ready to respond.
Thank you, Nate and Mordecai. And Mordecai, that actually feeds nicely into our next participant question, which is about security and privacy concerns. What are the security privacy concerns being evaluated with private partnerships?
You want to take that one, Nate?
Sure. There's a number of them, and it goes multiple directions. So, for instance, under FERPA, we have obviously an obligation to protect our student data, particularly the personally identifiable information. When we're talking about entering into partnerships with other organizations, that has to be really front of mind. In particular, if you've got organizations, and this is very common with coffee shops, restaurants, other kinds of groups, if students are accessing our coursework and our data systems through those means, we have to do everything we can on our end to protect private information being transferred back and forth through our learning management system. That can be really, really tricky. I can't confess that we have that totally resolved yet, but we certainly are paying attention to it. A second comes in the form when we're a partner with other agencies and we're providing access to our infrastructure. So as an example, both Northern Arizona University and Coconino Community College, both of us headquartered in Flagstaff, are working to try and provide internet access and free Wi-Fi in community locations throughout our county. A lot of K-12 students are accessing that. K-12 students have some very specific laws and statutes around what they are and are not allowed to access through an educational network. We have to think carefully about what kind of filtration are we providing. That is not something we normally have to worry about with our higher ed students. So when we're the provider of infrastructure, we've got some kinds of concerns. When we are piggybacking on top of other people's infrastructure, we have different kinds of concerns. And when we're entering into a joint partnership to build out resources, we have yet another kind of concern. So there's lots of things going on. When you start, there's always a balance between accessibility and security. Maintaining that balance is very challenging. It's something you've absolutely got to be paying attention to. Sometimes virtual private networks, systems like the Edge of Rome network, things like that can help. But you gotta really be in the weeds figuring out what's going on. Mordecai, anything to?
Yeah, nothing much to add there because we just haven't been a part of any of those partnerships in the midst of this time that I'm aware of. So thank you for that, Dave.
I will say one other thing, piggybacking on top of that, it's not just the security and privacy concerns. It's also we're hearing from a number of our students that they've had to increase the number of hours they're working, to pay for their increased data capacity through their cell networks and other kinds of things, and to buy the devices that they need. In some cases, we're able to provide devices as an institution. In other cases, we're not. So it's interesting to hear about the increased financial burden that our students are incurring with devices, cellular data access, and interestingly, the tools we're asking them to use often don't come free. Learning management systems we provide to them, but if it's a publisher provided resource, if it's a homework system, if it's a virtual lab kit, they're incurring costs that they've never had to incur before, and we've got to be sensitive to that as well.
Nate, you talk about that. There was an article this morning in Inside Higher Ed about the expenses that faculty may incur, sometimes significant because of remote working. So students, faculty, also staff. And I think we need to be very cognizant of that. We have just about 10 minutes left, and I don't see any other questions in chat, but I have a question that may be a little tangential to the subject of this, but I was very taken by the slide that you had, Nate, that had the student perspective on it. And the final quote there, the third quote, was a student with GAD and social anxiety who mentioned the positive outcomes for her of working remotely, working through Zoom. And I'm curious if you could, both or either of you could talk a little bit about that, how you might have seen that in terms of inclusiveness and this access gap, et cetera.
We're gonna defer to each other here. Yeah, so we've been having a lot of conversations about, so what lessons have we learned that are going to play a part of our long-term strategy? In our county, with the distances that people travel to get to places, we have, shame on us maybe in hindsight, been reticent to deliver video conference classes to people's homes and personal devices, because we aren't able to guarantee a level of quality in terms of the user experience. We have learned loudly and clearly that must be a part of our delivery package moving forward. We are starting to consider a delivery modality moving forward where it's about a third asynchronous online, about a third synchronous remote through Zoom or other tools, and about a third in person. That's a very different mix than we've ever practiced before. But we're hearing, and you're hearing this in the K-12 sector as well, there are students who are learning better through these remote modalities than they ever learned face-to-face because they can get to it. They don't have the social anxiety, those kinds of things. Conversely, we're also hearing that there are students who, without that social engagement, are absolutely floundering. Whether it's a personal learning style or it's just a personality characteristic, they feel isolated, they feel cut off, they're having a hard time focusing. So we're hearing both the good that has come from us learning how to deliver in new ways and the challenges that have come from that as well. And I'll flip over to the student services side for a minute. We have people who are accessing academic and career advising now who have never engaged in it before because they don't have to come to campus, they don't have to set up an appointment, they don't have to build in the travel time, they don't have to find childcare, they don't have to do all of the things that have kept them from accessing those services before. Now they can do it. We've also heard from students saying, is there any way I can just meet with somebody in person? This isn't working for me. So really what we're hearing is the concerns that have always existed among us students amplified to a new level.
I'll jump in there. Thank you for that, Nate. I'll jump in there and say two things. Number one, we've realized more than ever that we're now entering into a new normal, right? We will never return back to what was in regards to our delivery of instruction to students. So what does that look like? What we've been doing at St. Philip's is integrating more asynchronous opportunities for our students. Why? Because what we were finding is by offering the synchronous instruction courses, there were too many students that had signed up initially to say, yes, that sounds great. I'll take instruction between 8 and 10. However, they weren't ready for the demands of being an at-home principal now that so many of our kiddos are not returning to the classroom at the same rate as once thought or hoped. And so those demands, and I'm personally speaking to it as a parent of 2 children, it is pretty demanding. So now we've began to really dial back and say, what can we do for more asynchronous opportunities of instruction to increase flexibility? And even if that course is being offered by synchronous means, we still need to record it because we don't need to penalize the student for attempting to do what they could to continue their pathway. The second thing I'll mention is 30% of our academic portfolio is career and technical education at St. Philip's. And so I would say one of the things that has truly come to light is our dependency on infrastructure, physical face-to-face instruction to deliver those sorts of programs. So now we're asking ourselves, where can we innovate? What can we do a better job of delivery of that instruction at home and by flexible means to create more opportunities for pathway completion for those students in those programs?
And Mordecai, it strikes me that, it's not just the students that can benefit from the flexibility of asynchronous instruction and opportunities, it's the faculty as well. Not to mention staff, if they, like you, are juggling children in school and potentially, healthcare issues because of the pandemic and others, et cetera. So there's a lot of benefits for that for everybody. But it sounds like, Nate, to come back to what you said, that what's really hitting home here is that one method, one pedagogical method doesn't suit everybody usually. So it's yet another lesson that having a variety of approaches and methods can sometimes be the most successful way to approach learning and instruction.
Yeah, there's also been some fun learning moments for us. When you're in an in-person class, you have to remind people not to be on Facebook during class. When they're on Zoom, you have to remind them that it's probably not appropriate to have their phone set up next to the cash register while they're serving customers. It's been interesting teaching people how to learn in these modalities.
Thank you, Nate. That's great. And by the way, we have another question. We've got about 5 more minutes, so we might have time for another question after this if any of our participants have any further questions. But this question is short and sweet, but I think a pretty important one at this time. Can you use CARE Act funds to assist?
I'll jump in there on that one, Nate. Absolutely, absolutely. And I would only hope that institutions have had those strategic conversations with their leadership on what they could be doing to serve and close that gap for students. At St. Philip's College, we roughly had about $3.4 million to serve students in the midst of this crisis. And so, for those that were following this, 50%, half of that was made available by emergency aid funds to students. And so $1.7 million of that, we put a team together in a matter of 7 days, outlined a plan on what we would do to serve our students. Again, high levels of poverty. You heard Dr. Southerland talk about his populations as well. So we set up an opportunity where students, we can hear the concerns directly, see what those were, see if they met the guidelines associated with the CARES Act funding, and we were able to fund $1.7 million for students that were impacted significantly by COVID-19. The other $1.7 million was utilized in terms of assisting in the robustness of our IT infrastructure and what we could do for increased outreach to students, as well as to support them by the needs of the laptop program, the Wi-Fi hotspot program that I talked about, as well as ensuring that our faculty were dialed up and ready to go, because they also had to make the shift as well. We had some faculty, staff who didn't have internet access at home. So it was an entirely capacity increase for the entire institution. Nate?
Yeah, and in addition to that, we did a very similar thing in terms of the direct aid to students, some investments in our infrastructure. Also used some of our funding to provide training for faculty, used some of our funding to pay for course redevelopment over the summer, have used some of our funds to pay for physical facility adjustments that needed to happen, increased social distancing in nursing labs and in construction labs, virtual trainers to start providing some of that capacity outside of our physical facility. So yes, you can use the CARES Act funding in a variety of creative ways to help address some of these issues. Coming back to though the underlying infrastructure, the one thing the CARES Act money cannot do is take the place of infrastructure build out. So we continue to need to put some pressure on. There's been some ideas floated around expanding access to the E-rate program, for instance. K-12 schools and public libraries can currently access the E-rate funding. Higher ed institutions can't. Is there something similar that we can get in place that will help the higher ed institutions and business and industry build out this rural infrastructure? So the CARES Act funding is a good kind of one-time infusion, but there are longer term issues that we need to continue to keep at the forefront of our minds as well in terms of getting people access to infrastructure.
Well, we are about out of time, and I for one want to say how much I appreciate getting what is a very unique perspective from St. Philip's College, Mordecai, because as you said, you're the only college that's both an HBCU and an HSI. But we've also gotten the incredibly valuable perspective from a college that serves a significant tribal population, Nate. So I have been struck by the commonalities between the two and the challenges that you're facing, especially one is a rural, one is a largely urban, but then also it sounds like, a little bit of nuanced challenges that you have. So I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. Nate and Mordecai, I want to thank you as well for these incredible, invaluable perspectives. And Megan, I'd also like to thank you for your assistance during the session today. And thank you, everybody. Have a great meeting.